So I am delighted today to be able to host Rick Boothby, and we'll be talking about a series of concepts, but one of the topics that we will try to kind of zero in and circulate around is a concept that is of particular importance, certainly to one of Rick's most recent publications, but perhaps to more than one, and that's the notion of das Ding. So we'll speak a little bit about that. Rick, of course, is something of a hero, certainly to me and to many in the world of Lacanian scholarship. A number of his books have been very crucial in my own progress through this wild world of Lacanian theory. Of course, there's Death and Desire, which here appears in the Routledge Library edition, and also Freud as Philosopher. But what we're going to focus on a little bit more directly today are two new books. One is Embracing the Void, Rethinking the Origin of the Sacred. And we will also perhaps make some reference to Blown Away, which is a really, really powerful text in which Rick recounts some of his recovery from the event of his son's suicide. So Rick, we're delighted to have you here. And if I had more of an audience, we'd all be clapping, but thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Derek. I'm clapping for your willingness to do the interview and hope that it will interest your listeners. It's true that the two books that you mentioned are coming out or came out, very much close to each other. And it's all the more appropriate because they actually were deeply linked. It's now 16 years since my 23-year-old son, Oliver, really in despair over a really intractable addiction to heroin, shot himself to death. Which, of course, as you can imagine, threw me into the most incredible place of darkness I've ever been in my life. And I started making sort of diary-like entries or just writing almost compulsively, simply to stay sane, and ended up taking a whole summer, a couple of years after his death, and doing almost nothing but writing. A kind of, I didn't even think of it as a memoir. I thought of it as just a kind of a journal of my own reflections and reactions and so on. It was an incredibly dark text that really was not intended, nor really, I think, could have been digested by much of anybody else. It was really for my own purposes. And I ended up, after some years, just kind of leaving it in the drawer, happy that I had chronicled my own reaction to his death and so on, but it just kind of wasn't something publishable. Then over that period of 16 years, about 10 years in, to my amazement, partly because I had entered into a very intensive return to the psychoanalytic couch, a lot of things changed for me. And I found myself, to my amazement, not only surviving his death, but feeling, in a certain sense, enriched by it, which was enormously surprising to me. And one of the themes that really came through most powerfully was the liberating experience of accepting what I could not know, both about who my son really was and what happened to him and to us. When I began this memoir, it was the drive to know that it was the primary engine. And over years, really the better part of a decade, I began to not only realize that that was an unending task and ultimately an impossible task, but I also began to realize that accepting the domain of what I cannot know, the domain of unknowing, was actually strangely liberating. Previously, I would have thought of it as a defeat and as a kind of taking refuge in a kind of negation, but it became something really, in a certain strange sense, positive. And that, only later did I realize it, but that seeded Embracing the Void. this book about religion from a Lacanian point of view, and very much intersected with a very, very long-standing interest of mine in the concept of das Ding, the unknown in the other, that Lacan so spectacularly theorizes in his 7th seminar, and then, strangely enough, seems to largely abandon. So that it's interesting that you select those themes as things that interested you a lot. They were definitely absolutely central to my own interest, and linked these two books.
I was wondering if you could maybe, I mean, the way you speak about your experiences makes me wonder whether part of the writing process in what was presumably a terrible and awfully dark time, whether the writing process was in some ways akin to not just a mourning process, but akin to something of what one may have hoped an analysis might be able to achieve.
The answer to that is definitely yes, but also a measured no. The writing process was hugely helpful to me, and it is, of course, very deeply akin to an analysis, because, of course, you're speaking to an unknown auditor. Still, I had a much more vivid sense of what transference really is about after spending 3.5 years in analysis, aftermath of Oliver's death. I had been in analysis before with great profit, and was happy that I did, but I hadn't been on the couch out of a really desperate feeling of necessity. That certainly was the case after his death. It was really a struggle for me, really a struggle. So I was 4 times a week for more than 3 years, and it was hugely transformative, very, very helpful. And the writing absorbed a lot of that. In fact, the memoir alternates between diary entries, quite literally diary entries during the week following his shooting himself. And then other chapters, literally switching back and forth, other chapters that are basically presented to the reader as psychoanalytic sessions. Of course, they are in fact distillations, condensations of many sessions, but I crafted them into what is at least believable for the reader as a limited number of single sessions where a thread kind of follows through them.
I don't know why this just popped into my head, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the role of dreams in mourning, in some of the work that you did, in terms of your writing, in terms of the process of processing something of this traumatic experience.
Well, that's a better question than Derek. One of the painful things about the memoir in its present form, which basically I feel very happy with. I'm amazed, in fact. I think the memoir is actually now in a form that really is not only readable by somebody else without too much sort of darkness, but is also quite enriching, I think, probably for a reader. In other words, it's something that someone could really take something into their own life, I think, from it. However, it took a long time to get there. And one of the things that I had to do was to take what I had the reams of material that I had written and edit it rather violently, really. And a lot of what got edited, perhaps kind of interesting, were dreams, which was painful to me. There's still a few crucial dreams in the book, 2 really crucial ones. But I found a lot of the material on the cutting room floor were dreams, which is sad in the sense that it would have been a stronger memoir of a psychoanalytic experience had I left more of those dreams and they're kind of working through in the book. But it was too long, and I think even the best of readers wouldn't have made it through all of it. So in the interest of making a book that was really kind of accessible, I ended up cutting a lot of them, but they were hard to cut because they were so meaningful. As with any really traumatic experience, a really significant experience, it bred very powerful dreams, and for some years after the event, and they really were very interesting for me to explore after his death, and rather painful to have to eliminate so many of them to make a readable book.
Yeah, your comments just caused me to reflect a little bit. I can't speak for you, but in many stages of my life, the Lacanian psychoanalysis has been in large part an intellectual preoccupation. But of course, there are times when one's in analysis, or when one is forced into analysis, so to speak, when it is no longer merely an intellectual pastime. And I think the level of engagement, or what psychoanalysis can do and what can offer in those situations, is kind of a whole new level. Anyway, it's just a comment. But what also occurred to me when you were speaking was, having read the two books in tandem, I was aware that there was some points of intersection, but for some reason I tried to maybe keep them apart. I don't know why. Maybe it's because of how painful the subject matter, the contents of Blown Away are, particularly for anyone who's a parent. But hearing you talk, I have a heightened sense of the intersections, and one of those concerns the theme of unknowability, which you've just referred to. So I'm wondering if that's one way to take us into thinking a little bit more about dusting. I'm interested generally in the multiple trajectories that may have taken you to particularly foreground or be particularly fascinated by this concept. But maybe the topic of a certain form of unknowability might help introduce one facet of dusting.
You're more than you may know, Derek. You're leading me into my, it's like Brer Rabbit being led into the briar patch. I think this is absolutely for me, the most fertile entry into both books. And I've been fascinated by the problematic of dusting for almost all of my time which has been my whole postgraduate career, interested in psychoanalysis and Lacan in particular. I even was surprised when I went back and read Freud as philosopher again in the last few years, at how much I had already been wrestling with the meaning of this term and concept, dusting, because I had immersed myself in it with Embracing the Void. Embracing the Void, by the way, was not the original title. The editors did not like the original title, which was Is Nothing Sacred? I liked it because that was absolutely the answer to the whole question in the book. Is nothing sacred? The answer is absolutely yes. Mm-hmm. Nothing is precisely what has been taken as the core experience of the sacred, a kind of experience of something abyssal, something unknown. Anyway, I'm in some ways even happier with Embracing the Void, because the question is precisely, how does it benefit us? And why don't we more regularly and openly embrace what is abyssal? What is the nature of our relationship to it? And why at bottom is it the very definition for Lacan of anxiety? That's one of the things, of course, that he carries on into the post-Seminar VII period of his teaching. He weirdly, as you know, introduces it in Seminar VII, the seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis in 57. He introduces the concept of dusting, the thing, as what is unknown in the fellow human being. He takes his point of departure from Freud's very brief but very evocative passage in The Project for a Scientific Psychology, the unpublished 1895 manuscript, where he divides what he calls the Nebenmensch, the neighbor, the fellow human being, the first example of which, of course, is the maternal other, the mother. He theorizes that the infant, or the at least early child, at some point, some fairly precocious point in its development, recognizes that the mother has two aspects. One of them is recognizable in terms of exactly what Lacan calls the imaginary relation, a kind of echoing of body shapes and movements and so on, a kind of dance that the mother and the child do with each other, reflecting each other. And that all registers with the child as familiar and reassuring. But there's also a dimension which Lacan follows Freud in calling das Ding, which is uncognizable, says Freud. And this encounter, which the child really doesn't know how to contextualize or how to make use of in any significant way, nevertheless, Freud says, informs all subsequent attempts of the child to cognize objects. So the first lesson of the whole idea, which Lacan initially seems to take wholesale into his own thought, is that all of our cognitions, all of our apprehensions, better put apprehensions, because they divide into one dimension which is cognizable, is recognizable, and another dimension which frustrates cognition and presents the subject with something cognitively indigestible, a kind of surd, a kind of leftover or remainder that is maybe really quite advisedly, I use the word, is haunting. Later, 3 years after the 7th seminar, in the 10th seminar on anxiety, he devotes only one mention that I know of in that entire seminar to das Ding, but it's extremely significant. He says, at bottom, anxiety is not without an object, countering both Freud and Lacan, who both characterize anxiety as fear without an object. Lacan says, no, anxiety is not without an object. In fact, he says, it is directly related to the most profound object, das Ding. So it's the object which has no exactly known content, the abyssal object or the abyssal aspect of the object. And this, he says, is the really primordial stimulant of what we call anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's so much there, including the idea that das Ding, or the object, or the uncognizable facet of another human object, or another object more generally, doesn't go away, that it's this subtracted space that exists, or the subtracted potentiality of a space that exists in myriad different objects and within perception itself.